The sun burned like molten copper over the Afghan desert as the convoy of military vehicles cut through the dusty road. Staff Sergeant Maria Chen gripped the steering wheel of her Humvee, her eyes scanning the horizon through polarized sunglasses. The heat shimmered off the sand, creating mirages that danced in the distance. She had been stationed in Helmand Province for 8 months now, and every day felt like a test of endurance against both the enemy and the unforgiving environment. Maria was part of a logistics unit responsible for delivering supplies to forward operating bases scattered across the region. Her convoy consisted of 5 vehicles carrying food, ammunition, medical supplies, and equipment that soldiers at remote outposts desperately needed. The route they traveled was known to be dangerous. Improvised explosive devices had claimed the lives of too many service members along this very stretch of road. Beside her sat Private Danny Morrison, a young soldier from Texas who never stopped talking about his family's ranch. In the back, Corporal James Wu kept watch through the armored window, his rifle ready. The radio crackled with periodic check-ins from other vehicles in the convoy. Everything seemed routine, but Maria knew better than to let her guard down. The landscape around them was desolate and beautiful in its own harsh way. Rocky outcrops jutted from the sand like ancient monuments. Scattered villages appeared occasionally, their mud brick buildings blending into the earth. Children sometimes waved at the passing vehicles. And Maria always wondered about their lives, their dreams, their fears in this war-torn land. As they approached a narrow pass between 2 hills, Maria felt her instincts prickle. This was exactly the kind of place where ambushes happened. She slowed down slightly, her training kicking in. The convoy commander's voice came through the radio, reminding everyone to maintain spacing and stay alert. Maria acknowledged and kept her focus sharp. Then it happened. The explosion was deafening. The lead vehicle erupted in a ball of fire and smoke, flipping onto its side. Maria slammed on the brakes as debris rained down on her windshield. Her heart pounded as adrenaline flooded her system. Enemy fire erupted from the hills on both sides. Bullets pinged off the armored plating of her Humvee. Years of training took over. Maria maneuvered her vehicle to provide cover while radioing for backup. Danny returned fire from his position, while James kicked open the back door to help wounded soldiers from the destroyed lead vehicle. The air filled with the smell of burning fuel, gunpowder, and blood. The sounds of battle created a chaotic symphony of shouting, gunfire, and explosions. Maria grabbed her rifle and joined the fight, providing covering fire as James dragged 2 injured soldiers to safety. One of them was Lieutenant Harris, their convoy commander, who had severe burns and shrapnel wounds. The other was Specialist Torres, unconscious and bleeding from multiple injuries. Maria's medical training kicked in as she began triage while still under fire. The firefight lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. Apache helicopters arrived overhead, their guns silencing the enemy positions in the hills. A quick reaction force arrived with armored vehicles and medics, but the damage was done. 3 soldiers were dead, 5 were injured, and the mission was compromised. As the dust settled and the wounded were evacuated, Maria stood among the wreckage, her uniform soaked with sweat and blood that wasn't her own. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by exhaustion and the weight of what had just happened. She had performed her duties well, but 3 families would receive devastating news because of this day. The convoy limped back to the forward operating base, their mission incomplete. Maria spent the next several hours being debriefed, writing reports and checking on the wounded soldiers who had been stabilized at the base medical facility. Lieutenant Harris would survive but needed evacuation to Germany for specialized treatment. Specialist Torres was in critical condition, fighting for his life. That night, Maria couldn't sleep. She lay in her bunk, replaying every moment of the ambush in her mind. Could she have done something differently? Should she have spotted the danger signs earlier? These questions haunted her, even though her commanding officer had praised her actions and recommended her for a commendation. Days turned into weeks, and the routine of military life continued. Maria led several more convoy missions, each one successful but tense. The memory of the ambush stayed with her like a shadow. She became more cautious, more vigilant, perhaps too much so. Her fellow soldiers noticed the change but understood. Combat changed everyone who experienced it. 3 months after the ambush, Maria's unit received orders for a special mission. They would be transporting sensitive equipment and personnel to a classified location, deep in Taliban-controlled territory. The mission was dangerous and would require coordination with Special Operations Forces. A Navy SEAL team would provide security and tactical support. Maria felt both honored and anxious about the assignment. Working with SEALs meant the mission was critical. It also meant the danger level was extremely high. She spent days preparing, checking and rechecking every detail of her vehicle, studying maps and running through contingency plans. Her team respected her thoroughness, knowing their lives might depend on such preparation. The morning of the mission arrived with a blood-red sunrise that seemed ominous. Maria met with the SEAL team commander, Lieutenant Jackson Reed, a tall man with sharp eyes and a reputation for completing impossible missions. He briefed her on the route, timing, and protocols. The SEALs would travel in separate vehicles, providing advance reconnaissance and rear security. As they prepared to depart, Maria felt the familiar mix of fear and focus that came before dangerous missions. She said a silent prayer, something she had started doing after the ambush. Then she climbed into her Humvee, started the engine, and waited for the signal to move out. The convoy rolled through the gates of the base as dawn broke fully over the desert. Maria didn't know it then, but this mission would change everything. The decisions made in the coming hours would test everyone involved in ways they couldn't imagine. And somewhere ahead in the vast expanse of sand and stone, fate was already setting the stage for a mistake that would haunt them all. The convoy moved through the desert like a chain of metal beasts, engines rumbling against the silence of the wilderness. Maria kept her eyes on the road ahead, maintaining the careful distance from the vehicle in front of her. The SEAL team's vehicles flanked the convoy, their presence both reassuring and a reminder of the mission's danger level. Private Morrison sat beside her again, but this time he wasn't talking about his family ranch. He was quiet, focused, checking his weapon and scanning the terrain. Corporal Wu remained in the back, his usual position, but there was a tension in the air that everyone felt. This wasn't a routine supply run. The cargo they carried was classified, and the destination was in a part of the country where American forces rarely ventured. Lieutenant Reed's voice came through the radio with updates every 15 minutes. His team was scouting ahead, checking for any signs of enemy activity or improvised explosive devices. So far, everything looked clear, but Maria knew that meant nothing. The enemy was patient and clever. They could strike when you least expected it. The landscape changed as they traveled deeper into hostile territory. The flat desert gave way to rocky terrain with narrow valleys and steep cliffs. This was perfect ambush country, and Maria's grip on the steering wheel tightened. She remembered her training instructor's words from years ago about staying calm under pressure, about trusting your instincts but not letting fear control you. 2 hours into the journey, they passed through a small village. Women in burqas watched from doorways while children played in the dusty streets. A few old men sat outside a tea house, their weathered faces showing neither welcome nor hostility. Maria wondered what they thought of the American soldiers passing through their home. Did they see them as protectors or invaders? The answer probably depended on which day you asked and what had happened recently. The radio crackled. One of the SEAL team members reported a disabled vehicle on the road ahead. Lieutenant Reed's voice was calm but alert as he ordered the convoy to slow down and maintain extra vigilance. Disabled vehicles were sometimes used to lure convoys into ambushes. Everyone's weapons came up, fingers near triggers but not on them. Professional soldiers knew the difference. As they approached, Maria could see it was an old Soviet-era truck, rusted and listing to one side with a flat tire. It appeared abandoned, but Reed's team wasn't taking chances. 2 SEALs dismounted and carefully approached the vehicle, checking for explosives or hidden threats. After several tense minutes, they gave the all-clear signal. Just a broken-down truck, probably abandoned weeks ago. The convoy moved past and continued deeper into the mountains. The road became rougher, forcing Maria to slow down to navigate the turns and uneven surface. The communication equipment in the back of her Humvee contained encryption systems that would be used to establish a secure forward communications post. Losing that equipment wasn't an option. Around midday, they stopped for a brief rest in a protected valley. The soldiers stretched their legs, ate quick meals, and refilled water bottles. The heat was oppressive, and even with air conditioning in the vehicles, everyone was sweating. Maria checked her vehicle's systems, making sure everything was functioning properly. Mechanical failure out here could be as deadly as enemy action. Lieutenant Reed approached her during the break. His face was streaked with dust and sweat, but his eyes were sharp and assessing. He asked how she was holding up and whether she had any concerns about the route ahead. Maria appreciated that he treated her as a professional equal, not differently because she was a woman. She told him about a narrow pass coming up that worried her and showed him on the map. Reed studied it, nodded, and said his team would scout it extra carefully. They spoke briefly about the ambush 3 months earlier. Reed had read the after-action report and complimented her handling of the situation. He said that kind of cool-headedness under fire was exactly why she had been chosen for this mission. Maria felt a mix of pride and sorrow. The commendation on her record meant nothing compared to the 3 soldiers who hadn't come home. After 30 minutes, the convoy resumed its journey. The narrow pass Maria had worried about appeared an hour later, a winding cut through towering rock walls that blocked out the sun. Reed's team went through first, checking every shadow and crevice. When they signaled all clear, the convoy followed, moving slowly through the claustrophobic space. Maria held her breath until they emerged on the other side, where the land opened up into a broad valley with scattered vegetation and a dried riverbed running through it. According to the map, their destination was another 3 hours away in the mountains beyond this valley. The hardest part of the journey still lay ahead. As they crossed the valley, Maria noticed something that made her uneasy. Birds suddenly took flight from a cluster of trees near the dried riverbed, as if something had disturbed them. She mentioned it over the radio and Reed acknowledged. His team altered their formation, spreading out more to cover wider angles. Nothing happened. The birds probably fled from a fox or some other animal, but Maria's instincts remained on edge. She had learned to trust that inner voice, the one that whispered warnings when something wasn't right. Every veteran soldier developed it, and those who ignored it didn't usually live long enough to become veterans. The afternoon sun beat down as they began climbing into the mountains on a rough trail that barely qualified as a road. The vehicle struggled with the steep incline, engines straining, tires fighting for purchase on loose gravel. Maria downshifted and took it slow, careful not to push her Humvee beyond its limits. Halfway up the mountain, Lieutenant Reed called a halt. He wanted to assess the route ahead before committing the whole convoy to it. 2 SEALs moved forward on foot while everyone else waited in their vehicles, alert for any threats. Maria used the time to check her equipment again and hydrate. Morrison made a nervous joke about wishing they had brought hiking boots instead of combat boots. Wu told him to shut up and stay focused. The scouts returned with good news. The route was passable all the way to the destination. No signs of enemy activity, no obstacles that couldn't be overcome. Reed gave the order to proceed, and the convoy began the final leg of the journey. As they crested the mountain and saw their destination below, a fortified compound built into the side of a cliff, Maria felt relief wash over her. They had made it. The mission was nearly complete. Just a careful descent, delivery of the cargo, and then they could start the journey back to base. But that relief was premature. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, none of them knew that the real test was about to begin. The most dangerous part of their mission wasn't the journey there. It would be what happened next in the fading light, when split-second decisions and assumptions would lead to consequences none of them could have anticipated. The fortified compound clung to the mountainside like a fortress from another century. High walls made of stone and reinforced concrete surrounded several buildings, with guard towers at each corner. American and Afghan flags flew side by side on a central pole. This was a joint operations base, one of the most remote and secure facilities in the region, used for gathering intelligence and launching classified operations deep into enemy territory. Maria guided her Humvee through the heavily fortified gate after the guards verified their identification. Inside the compound, soldiers moved with purpose between buildings. Some were American Special Forces, others were Afghan commandos working alongside them. The atmosphere was different from regular bases, more intense, more secretive. Everyone here had a specific mission and spoke only about what was necessary. The convoy parked in a designated area, and Maria's team began the process of unloading the sensitive communications equipment they had transported. Lieutenant Reed coordinated with the base commander, a grizzled colonel named Patterson who had been in Afghanistan for more tours than most soldiers could count. He had a reputation for being tough but fair, someone who cared deeply about the men and women under his command. As the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the compound, Maria and her team worked quickly to transfer the cargo to the communications building. The equipment was heavy and required careful handling. Specialized technicians from the base took over once everything was inside, immediately beginning the installation process. The new system would give them real-time satellite communication, capabilities and advanced encryption that would keep their operations secure from enemy interception. Morrison and Wu helped with the unloading while Maria completed paperwork with the supply officer. She was told they would rest at the compound for the night and begin the return journey at first light. The trip back would be just as dangerous, maybe more so because now the enemy might have spotted their convoy and would be waiting to strike on their return route. The base had a small dining facility where Maria and her team ate dinner, alongside SEALs and Special Forces operators. The food was better than at most forward operating bases, probably because this compound had regular helicopter resupply missions. The conversations around her were quiet and professional. These men had seen combat more times than they could count, and it showed in their eyes and the economy of their words. Lieutenant Reed sat down across from Maria with his tray. He looked tired but satisfied that the mission had gone smoothly so far. They talked about the return journey, discussing alternate routes and timing. Reed suggested leaving earlier than dawn to take advantage of darkness for the first part of the trip. Maria agreed that was a good tactical decision. As they talked, an explosion echoed in the distance somewhere beyond the compound walls. Everyone in the dining facility stopped eating, alert but not panicking. Such sounds were not uncommon in this part of Afghanistan. A few moments later, the base loudspeakers announced that it was a controlled detonation by explosive ordnance disposal teams, destroying enemy munitions they had discovered. Everyone relaxed and returned to their meals. After dinner, Maria checked on her vehicle one more time, making sure everything was secure and ready for the morning. The mechanics at the base had offered to give all the convoy vehicles a quick inspection, and she accepted gratefully. They found and fixed a minor issue with her brake line that could have become serious on the mountain roads. The sleeping quarters assigned to Maria and her team were basic but clean. Bunks with thin mattresses, lockers for gear, and little else. Maria lay down fully clothed except for her boots, her rifle within arm's reach. Sleep came slowly despite her exhaustion. Her mind kept running through scenarios for the return trip, planning for contingencies, worrying about things she couldn't control. Around midnight, she was awakened by activity outside. Voices spoke urgently and vehicles started up. Maria grabbed her rifle and boots, quickly making herself ready. Morrison and Wu were already awake, doing the same. They moved to the door and saw SEAL team members gearing up for what looked like an emergency mission. Maria found Lieutenant Reed near his vehicle. He was checking weapons and equipment with his team. When he saw her approach, he explained that they had received intelligence about a high-value target in a village 10 kilometers away. The SEALs were being sent to capture or kill this individual before he could escape. It was the kind of mission they specialized in, fast and surgical. The SEAL team rolled out within 15 minutes, disappearing into the darkness beyond the compound gates. Maria returned to her quarters but couldn't sleep. She thought about Reed and his men heading into danger, about the risks they took on missions most people would never hear about. This was the nature of their war, fought in shadows, its victories and defeats often remaining classified for years. Hours passed slowly. Maria dozed off briefly, but woke with a start when she heard vehicles returning. She checked her watch. It was 4 a.m, still dark outside. Through the window, she could see the SEAL team's vehicles pulling back into the compound. Something about the way they moved seemed wrong. Too fast, too urgent. She pulled on her boots and went outside. What she saw made her heart sink. One of the SEAL vehicles was riddled with bullet holes. Team members were carrying a wounded comrade on a stretcher toward the medical facility. Other SEALs were helping injured teammates. The mission had clearly gone badly. Maria approached to offer help but was waved back by the base security. This was a classified operation, and only essential personnel were allowed near the returning team. She watched from a distance as medical staff rushed out to triage the wounded. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Something had gone very wrong out there in the darkness. Lieutenant Reed emerged from one of the vehicles, his uniform torn and bloodied. He wasn't injured, But his face showed the strain of combat and possibly something else, anger or frustration. He spoke intensely with Colonel Patterson, gesturing and pointing at a map. Other SEAL team members joined the conversation, their body language suggesting disagreement or confusion about something. Maria turned to head back to her quarters when she heard the roar of helicopter blades approaching. A Black Hawk swooped low over the compound, its searchlight sweeping the ground before it landed in the designated zone. The side doors opened and combat medics jumped out with their equipment, rushing toward the medical facility. This meant the injuries were serious enough to require evacuation. The base suddenly felt smaller, more claustrophobic. Maria realized that whatever had happened during the SEAL mission had changed the dynamic here. The compound was now on high alert. Guards had doubled at every position. Floodlights illuminated the perimeter walls. Everyone moved with weapons ready, expecting a potential attack and retaliation for the raid. As dawn began to break over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gray and pink, Colonel Patterson called a meeting of all senior personnel, including Maria as the convoy leader. They gathered in the operations center, a secure room filled with maps, computers, and communication equipment. Patterson's face was grave as he explained the situation. The SEAL raid had been partially successful in that they had eliminated the target, but there had been complications. Intelligence had been imperfect, and the enemy had been better prepared than expected. 2 SEALs were seriously wounded and were being evacuated. 3 others had minor injuries but could still function. Then Patterson dropped the real bombshell. During the firefight and the chaos and darkness, there had been confusion about identifying combatants versus civilians. Someone had been injured, an Afghan woman, and she had managed to escape the scene before the SEALs could determine her status or provide medical care. They didn't know if she was an enemy fighter, a civilian caught in the crossfire, or something else entirely. The situation was complicated and potentially explosive from a diplomatic standpoint. Finding this woman and determining what had happened was now a priority. Maria listened to all this with growing dread. She had a feeling that her simple convoy mission was about to become something much more complicated and dangerous. Colonel Patterson's words hung heavy in the operations center. The escaped woman represented a problem with multiple layers of danger. If she was an enemy combatant, she could alert other Taliban fighters about American positions and tactics. If she was a civilian, her injury could spark local outrage and complicate relations with the village elders. Either way, she was out there somewhere, possibly bleeding and in need of medical attention, and finding her had become urgent. Lieutenant Reed stood beside a large map of the area, pointing to the village where the raid had occurred. His voice was tight with frustration as he described what had happened. His team had approached the target compound under cover of darkness, using night vision equipment to maintain the element of surprise. The target, a Taliban commander responsible for numerous attacks on coalition forces, had been inside along with several fighters. The raid had started well. They breached the compound and engaged the enemy fighters. In the chaos of the firefight, with multiple rooms to clear and threats coming from various directions, Reed's team had encountered a figure in traditional Afghan clothing carrying what appeared to be a weapon. In the split second of decision-making that combat demanded, they had fired. Only later did they realize the figure was a woman, and the weapon might have been a walking stick or farming tool. She had been hit, but not fatally. When they secured the compound and returned to check on her, she was gone. Blood trail led away from the building into the darkness beyond the village. Despite searching for over an hour, they couldn't find her. The need to evacuate their own wounded and concerns about enemy reinforcements had forced them to abandon the search and return to base. Now, as morning light spread across the mountains, Patterson was organizing a search and rescue operation. But it was complicated. They couldn't send a large force into the village without proper authorization and coordination with Afghan government officials. They also had to consider that the woman might have reached other Taliban fighters, and any search party could be walking into an ambush. Maria listened to all this with a mixture of sympathy and dread. She understood the impossible situations combat put soldiers in, split-second decisions made in darkness and chaos. But she also understood the consequences when those decisions went wrong. An injured woman, possibly innocent, was somewhere in those mountains, and Maria's medical training made her want to help. Patterson looked directly at Maria when he outlined his plan. The original convoy was supposed to leave that morning, but now he needed them to stay longer. More importantly, he needed someone with medical training to potentially treat the injured woman if she was found. Maria was the most qualified person available besides the base medical staff, who couldn't be spared from their duties treating the wounded SEALs. The plan was to send a small team, including Maria, Lieutenant Reed, and several other soldiers, to search the area around the village. They would coordinate with local Afghan forces and village leaders, trying to find the woman and provide medical assistance if possible. It was part humanitarian mission, part damage control, and entirely dangerous. Maria felt her stomach tighten as she realized she was being pulled deeper into this situation. But she was a soldier, and soldiers followed orders. She nodded her acceptance of the assignment. Morrison and Wu would stay with the convoy while Maria joined the search team. Patterson emphasized that this had to be handled delicately. They needed to find the woman, determine what had happened, and provide whatever assistance was appropriate, all while maintaining security and not creating a larger incident. Within an hour, the search team was ready to depart. Maria had her medical kit expanded with extra supplies, including blood plasma, antibiotics, and surgical tools. She wore full combat gear, including body armor and helmet. The team consisted of 8 Americans, including herself and Reed, plus 6 Afghan commandos who would serve as translators and liaisons with the village. The convoy of 3 vehicles left the compound as the sun climbed higher. The village was only 10 kilometers away, but the rough mountain roads made it a slow journey. Maria rode with Reed, who was quiet and tense. She could see the weight of the situation pressing on him. This wasn't just about finding an injured woman. It was about his team's reputation, about doing the right thing, about preventing a mistake from becoming a catastrophe. They approached the village carefully, with the Afghan commandos leading the way. The village was small, maybe 30 or 40 families living in mud brick homes clustered around a central well. Fields of wheat and poppy surrounded the settlement. As the vehicles entered, Maria saw suspicious faces watching from doorways and windows. These people had lived through decades of war and trusted no one. The Afghan commandos spoke with the village elder, a man with a long white beard and traditional robes. The conversation was lengthy, with much gesturing and what appeared to be negotiation. Finally, the elder agreed to speak with the American team. Through translators, Reed explained they were looking for an injured woman who had fled during the night. They wanted to provide medical assistance. The elder's response was cautious. He admitted that a woman had returned to the village before dawn, bleeding from a gunshot wound. She was the niece of the Taliban commander who had been killed in the raid. She had been staying at his compound, helping care for his children. When the Americans attacked, she had panicked and grabbed the first thing she could find, which happened to be an old walking staff, and fled into the darkness. Maria felt her heart clench at this information. An innocent woman caught in a nightmare situation, the elder continued, explaining that the woman was now at her family's home, receiving what limited medical care the village could provide. But her condition was serious, and the elder feared she might not survive without proper treatment. Reed asked if they could see her and provide medical assistance. The elder hesitated, clearly weighing the risks. If he allowed the Americans access and something went wrong, the Taliban would hold him responsible. But if the woman died because he refused help, her family would blame him. After more discussion, he agreed, but insisted that only the female American soldier could enter the home. Out of respect for Afghan customs regarding men entering homes where women were present, this meant Maria would go in alone, without backup, into a potentially hostile environment. Reed didn't like it, but he understood they had no choice if they wanted to provide medical care. He looked at Maria, asking without words if she was willing to take this risk. Maria took a deep breath and nodded. This was why she had become a combat medic, to help people regardless of the circumstances. The elder led Maria through narrow streets to a small home near the edge of the village. Women and children watched silently as she passed. Maria felt their eyes on her, measuring, judging this foreign soldier who had come to their home. The elder knocked on the door and spoke in rapid Pashto. A woman's voice responded from inside. The door opened and Maria stepped into the dim interior. It took a moment for her eyes to adjust. The home was simple, with carpets on the floor and few furnishings. Several women stood against the walls, their faces covered except for their eyes. On a mat in the corner lay the injured woman. Maria knelt beside her and immediately assessed the situation. The woman was young, maybe 25, with pale skin and rapid, shallow breathing. Her clothing was soaked with blood from a gunshot wound in her upper left chest. The village women had tried to stop the bleeding with cloth bandages, but it wasn't enough. The woman was going into shock, and without immediate treatment, she would die within hours. Maria opened her medical kit and began working. She cut away the bloody clothing to expose the wound. The bullet had entered below the collarbone and exited through the back, missing the major blood vessels but probably collapsing the lung. Maria had treated similar wounds before, but never in conditions like this alone without backup, surrounded by people who had every reason to hate her. As she worked to stabilize the patient, inserting an IV line and preparing to seal the chest wound, Maria made eye contact with the injured woman. Despite the pain and fear in those eyes, there was also something else. A question perhaps, or maybe just awareness that this American soldier was trying to save her life. Maria did what she had been trained to do, focusing entirely on the medical emergency in front of her, blocking out everything else. Maria's hands moved with practiced precision as she worked to save the woman's life. The chest wound was serious but manageable if she acted quickly. She used a special seal designed for penetrating chest wounds, creating an airtight bandage that would prevent air from entering the chest cavity while allowing trapped air to escape. The woman gasped as the treatment took effect, her breathing becoming slightly less labored. The other women in the room watched in silence. Maria could feel their tension, their uncertainty about whether to trust this foreign soldier. She spoke softly in English, even though they couldn't understand her words, hoping her tone would convey that she was there to help. The injured woman's eyes remained fixed on Maria's face, searching for something. Perhaps reassurance, or maybe just trying to understand why the person who had been part of the force that shot her was now saving her life. Maria set up the IV line and began administering fluids to combat shock. She checked vital signs and found them weak but stabilizing. The immediate crisis was passing, but the woman needed proper surgery and hospital care beyond what could be provided here. Maria pulled out her radio and called Reed, who was waiting outside with the rest of the team. She explained the situation through the static. The woman would survive the immediate emergency, but she needed evacuation to a proper medical facility. Reed's response was immediate. He would arrange for a medevac helicopter to transport her to the base hospital. But there was a complication. The village elder was now expressing concerns about the woman being taken away by American forces. Her family feared they would never see her again, or worse, that she would be imprisoned. Maria understood their fear. Years of war had created deep distrust on all sides. She spoke with the women in the room through hand gestures and simple words, trying to communicate that the injured woman needed surgery that couldn't be done in the village. One of the older women, who appeared to be the patient's mother, began crying and speaking rapidly in Pashto. Maria didn't need translation to understand a mother's fear for her daughter. Lieutenant Reed entered the home, breaking protocol but recognizing the need to negotiate directly. Through an Afghan translator who had come with him, he spoke to the family. He explained that the woman would receive the best medical care at the American hospital. Once she was stable and recovered, she would be returned to her family. He gave his word as an officer, and the translator emphasized the importance of this promise in their culture. The discussion went back and forth for nearly 30 minutes. Time was critical for the patient, but rushing the family would only create more problems. Finally, the mother agreed, but only if she could accompany her daughter to the hospital. Reed agreed immediately. Whatever diplomatic or security complications this created could be handled later. Right now, getting the patient to surgery was the priority. The medevac helicopter arrived within 40 minutes, landing in an open field near the village. The rotor wash created a dust storm that obscured everything. Maria supervised as the patient was carefully moved onto a stretcher and carried to the helicopter. The mother followed, clutching her daughter's hand and crying. Maria climbed aboard as well to continue treatment during the flight. The helicopter lifted off, and Maria watched the village shrink below them. She continued monitoring the patient's vital signs as they flew. The woman was unconscious now, sedated to manage pain and reduce oxygen demand. Her mother sat nearby, looking terrified by her first helicopter ride, but refusing to leave her daughter's side. Maria tried to offer a reassuring smile, but the woman's face was covered, showing only fearful eyes. The flight to the base hospital took 20 minutes. Medical staff were waiting when they landed, rushing the patient into surgery immediately. Maria briefed the surgeon on the treatment she had provided and the patient's condition. The surgeon nodded approvingly at her work, saying she had almost certainly saved the woman's life with her quick actions in the village. As the patient was wheeled into surgery, the mother tried to follow but was gently stopped by hospital staff. She became agitated, not understanding what was happening or why she was being separated from her daughter. Maria stayed with her, using gestures and the translator, who had arrived from the operations center to explain that the doctors were operating and the mother would be able to see her daughter afterward. They waited in a small room near the surgical ward. Maria brought tea for both of them and sat quietly. The mother gradually calmed down, though her worry was evident. Through the translator, she asked Maria questions. Why had the Americans attacked the compound? Why had they shot her daughter? What would happen to her now? Maria answered as honestly as she could through the translator. She explained that they had been targeting a Taliban commander who had killed many people. The shooting of the daughter was a terrible mistake made in the darkness and confusion of combat. Maria emphasized that she personally was sorry for what had happened and that they were doing everything possible to make it right. The mother listened, her eyes showing a mix of emotions. Then she said something that the translator struggled to convey properly. Finally, he explained that the mother was saying her daughter was not Taliban. She had only gone to help care for her uncle's children after their mother died. She was innocent and had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The mother asked if Maria could understand what it was like to be caught in a war you didn't start and couldn't escape. Maria felt tears prick her eyes but held them back. She could understand. Every soldier who had been to Afghanistan had seen civilians suffer because of this endless conflict. She nodded slowly and said through the translator that she did understand, at least as much as anyone could who wasn't living through it every day. Hours passed. Maria stayed with the mother even though she had other duties waiting. This felt more important somehow. Finally, the surgeon emerged and reported that the operation had been successful. The bullet had collapsed the lung and fractured a rib, but there was no permanent damage to vital organs. The patient would recover fully with proper rest and rehabilitation. She was lucky, he added, looking at Maria. Lucky that someone with medical training had reached her quickly. The mother was allowed to see her daughter in the recovery room. Maria accompanied her and watched as the mother held her unconscious daughter's hand, whispering prayers and words of comfort. It was a deeply human moment that transcended the politics and violence of war. A mother's love for her child was universal, regardless of nationality, religion, or which side of a conflict you were on. Lieutenant Reed found Maria later that afternoon. He had spent the day dealing with the aftermath of the incident, writing reports, briefing Colonel Patterson, and coordinating with higher command about the situation. He looked exhausted but also relieved that the woman was going to survive. He thanked Maria for her work, both the medical treatment and the compassion she had shown the family. But Reed also delivered difficult news. A full investigation would be conducted into the shooting. His team would be questioned extensively about the rules of engagement, the identification of targets, and the decisions made during the raid. There could be consequences, including potential charges if the investigation determined that proper procedures weren't followed. The SEALs had operated by the book as they understood it, but when an innocent person was injured, everything was scrutinized. Maria felt the weight of this news. She had tremendous respect for Reed and his team. They were professionals who risked their lives fighting a difficult and often ambiguous war. But she also understood the need for accountability when things went wrong. The military couldn't just shrug off injuries to civilians, even accidental ones occurring during legitimate combat operations. Over the next 2 days, while the wounded woman recovered in the hospital, Maria and the other members of her original convoy remained at the base. They couldn't leave until the situation was resolved and proper arrangements were made. Maria visited the patient daily, checking on her recovery and building a tentative relationship with both her and her mother. The woman's name was Amina. When she was strong enough to talk, she asked to speak with Maria. Through a translator, she said she didn't blame the American soldiers for shooting her. She understood it was dark and confusing, but she wanted Maria to know that not everyone in Afghanistan was Taliban or an enemy. Many people just wanted to live peacefully and raise their families without war. Maria promised to remember that. She also made a personal decision that day. She would write a full statement for the investigation, supporting Lieutenant Reed and his team while also advocating for better procedures to prevent similar incidents in the future. The investigation into the shooting began 2 days after Amina's surgery. A team of officers from the Judge Advocate General's Corps arrived at the base by helicopter, bringing files, recording equipment, and the weight of military justice with them. They set up in a secure conference room and began interviewing everyone involved in the raid. Lieutenant Reed was questioned for over 6 hours on the first day. Maria saw him emerge looking drained, his jaw tight with stress. The other SEAL team members went through similar interrogations. They were asked to recount every detail of the mission, every decision, every moment leading up to the shooting. Combat situations that lasted seconds were now being analyzed frame by people who had never been in a firefight. Maria was called to testify on the third day. She sat across from a female major and a male lieutenant colonel, both lawyers, both experienced in investigating combat incidents. They were professional but thorough, asking her about the medical treatment she provided, her observations of the wound, and her interactions with Amina and her family. They wanted to understand the complete picture of what had happened and its aftermath. Maria answered every question honestly. She described Amina's injuries in medical terms, explaining that the wound pattern was consistent with being shot from the front at close to medium range. She described finding Amina in shock, near death, and the emergency treatment that stabilized her. She also spoke about the conversations with Amina and her mother, about Amina's insistence that she was not Taliban and had only been at the compound to help care for children. The investigators asked pointed questions about the SEAL team's conduct. Had they shown remorse? Had they tried to cover up the incident? Had they followed proper procedures? Maria defended them strongly. She explained that Lieutenant Reed had immediately organized the search operation once they realized an injured person had escaped. He had ensured Maria had all necessary medical supplies. He had negotiated carefully with the village to get access to the patient. Throughout, he had prioritized Amina's well-being despite the tactical and political complications. After the formal interview, the female major spoke to Maria off the record. She explained that the military took these incidents seriously, but she personally understood the impossible situations combat put soldiers in, split-second decisions in darkness and chaos. The question wasn't whether mistakes happened in war. They always did. The question was whether proper training, rules of engagement, and procedures had been followed, and whether appropriate actions were taken afterward to remedy the situation. That evening, Maria visited Amina again in the hospital. The young woman was sitting up now, still weak but clearly recovering. Her mother was there as always, rarely leaving her daughter's side. Through the translator, they had an extended conversation that went beyond the medical updates Maria usually provided. Amina told her story. She was a school teacher in a nearby town, one of the few women in the region who had received education and was passing it on to the next generation. Her uncle, the Taliban commander killed in the raid, had disapproved of her work but had tolerated it because she was family. When his wife died 6 months earlier, Amina had come to help care for his 5 children. She loved teaching but also felt obligated to her family. On the night of the raid, Amina had been sleeping in a room with the children. The explosions and gunfire woke her. The children were screaming in terror. She tried to calm them while also trying to understand what was happening. When armed men burst into the compound, she had no idea if they were Taliban attacking her uncle or someone else. She grabbed the walking staff her uncle used, thinking only of defending the children. She ran into the courtyard and saw men in strange uniforms and equipment she didn't recognize. In the darkness and chaos, someone shouted at her in a language she didn't understand. Terrified and confused, she raised the staff. Then there was a flash and impact, and suddenly she was on the ground in blinding pain. She heard more shouting and shooting. Somehow, driven by fear and adrenaline, she managed to crawl away from the compound and into the darkness. The walk back to the village through the night, bleeding and in agony, was something she barely remembered. She passed out twice. Finally, she stumbled into her family's home, collapsing in her mother's arms. They tried to treat her wound but knew it was beyond their capabilities. When the American soldiers came the next day, her family feared the worst. But then Maria had entered and provided medical care instead of violence. Amina looked at Maria with eyes that held complex emotions. She didn't hate the soldiers who had shot her. She understood they were doing their job in a confusing situation, but she wanted them to understand that she was a real person with dreams and a life, not just a mistake in their reports. She asked Maria if the soldiers felt sorry for what happened. Maria assured her they did, especially Lieutenant Reed, who had been carrying the guilt heavily. She explained that good soldiers felt the weight of every mistake, every civilian casualty, even when they were following orders and doing their best in impossible situations. Reed had told Maria privately that if he could go back to that moment, he would have taken an extra second to identify the target more clearly, even if it put his team at greater risk. That was the burden of conscience. The conversation shifted when Amina's mother asked Maria about her own life. Did she have children? Was she married? Why had she become a soldier? Maria found herself sharing things she rarely talked about. She explained that her parents had immigrated to America from Taiwan, working hard to give their children opportunities. She became a soldier to serve the country that had welcomed her family, and to prove that women could do any job, even combat roles. The mother nodded slowly, saying through the translator that mothers everywhere wanted the same things for their children: safety, opportunity, and respect. She said that despite the war and suffering, she appreciated what Maria had done for Amina. Not just the medical care, but treating her daughter with dignity and compassion when she could have been just another casualty of war. Days passed, and the investigation continued. More witnesses were interviewed. Intelligence analysts examined the pre-raid briefing materials, questioning whether the information provided to the SEAL team had been accurate and complete. Communications were reviewed. Procedures were analyzed. The process was thorough and tedious, as military investigations always were. Meanwhile, Amina continued to recover. The doctors cleared her to be discharged from the hospital, but there was a new complication. Taliban forces had learned about the incident and were making threats against Amina and her family, claiming they were collaborators for accepting American medical help. The village elder sent word that it wasn't safe for Amina to return home. Colonel Patterson faced a difficult decision. The military couldn't keep Amina at the base indefinitely, but sending her back to a dangerous situation seemed wrong, especially after everything that had happened. He consulted with Afghan government officials and American command, looking for solutions. Eventually, they worked out an arrangement. Amina and her mother would be relocated to a city in a safer part of Afghanistan, with enough resources to start a new life. Amina would be able to teach again, away from Taliban influence and the stigma of what had happened. On the day before Amina left, she asked to meet Lieutenant Reed. Maria arranged the meeting, which took place in a secure room with translators present. Reed looked uncomfortable as he sat across from the woman his team had accidentally shot. He began with an apology, taking full responsibility for what had happened. His voice was steady but filled with genuine remorse. Amina listened, then responded through the translator. She said she forgave him and his team. She understood they were in an impossible situation, making split-second decisions in the dark. She didn't want him to carry guilt for the rest of his life over an honest mistake. But she asked him for one thing. She wanted him to remember her not as a target or a casualty, but as a real person, a teacher who loved children, a daughter who cared for her mother, a human being caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Reed promised he would remember. The meeting was emotional, with both Reed and Amina wiping away tears. Maria watched from the side, understanding that this was a moment of healing for both of them. War created so much pain and trauma, but sometimes, rarely, there were moments of human connection that helped heal those wounds. The investigation concluded a week later. The findings were classified, but Colonel Patterson shared the basic results with those involved. The SEAL team had followed proper procedures based on the information available to them. The shooting was ruled an accident occurring during legitimate combat operations. No charges would be filed. However, the report included recommendations for improved target identification procedures and better intelligence gathering before raids. Lieutenant Reed accepted the results with mixed feelings. He was relieved his team wouldn't face charges, but that didn't erase the fact that they had shot an innocent woman. That was something he would carry with him forever, regardless of official findings. 2 weeks after arriving at the remote compound, Maria and her convoy finally received clearance to return to their home base. The mission that was supposed to take 2 days had stretched into an extended stay that changed everyone involved. As Maria prepared her Humvee for the journey back, she reflected on everything that had happened and how it had affected her understanding of war and duty. Morrison and Wu noticed the change in her. She was quieter, more thoughtful. The experience with Amina had added new layers to Maria's perspective on the conflict in Afghanistan. She had always known civilians suffered in war, but meeting Amina, treating her wounds, and hearing her story made it deeply personal in a way that no briefing or training ever could. The morning they departed, Lieutenant Reed came to see Maria off. His team would be staying at the compound for additional missions. They stood by her Humvee in the early dawn light, both of them tired but also somehow lighter than they had been weeks before. Reed thanked Maria again for everything she had done, not just the medical care but the compassion and humanity she had shown throughout the situation. Reed told Maria something he had learned during his career as a SEAL. The hardest part of war wasn't the combat or the danger. It was living with the consequences of decisions made in impossible situations. Good soldiers carried those consequences with honor, learned from them, and became better leaders because of them. He said Maria had shown him what that looked like, how to turn a terrible mistake into an opportunity for growth and understanding. Maria appreciated his words, but also pushed back gently. She said the credit belonged to Amina, who had shown remarkable grace and forgiveness despite being the victim. Amina could have been angry and vengeful, demanding punishment and compensation. Instead, she chose understanding and healing. That took more courage than anything Maria or Reed had done. The convoy rolled out as the sun climbed over the mountains, retracing the route they had taken weeks earlier. The landscape looked the same, but Maria saw it differently now. Every village they passed might have an Amina in it, someone just trying to live their life in the middle of chaos they didn't create. Every field and home represented dreams and families that had existed long before the war, and would hopefully continue long after it ended. The journey back was uneventful, which everyone appreciated. They didn't encounter any ambushes or roadside bombs. The only excitement came when they helped a local farmer whose truck had broken down, using their tools and mechanical knowledge to get him back on the road. Small acts of kindness like that probably did more for winning hearts and minds than any military operation. When they finally reached their home base 3 days later, Maria was surprised by what awaited her. Word had spread about the incident and her role in it. Several officers wanted to debrief her. The base commander wanted to meet with her. There was even talk of a commendation for her actions. Maria found all the attention uncomfortable. She had just done her job, what any combat medic would have done. During the debriefing sessions, Maria emphasized several points. First, the SEAL team had acted professionally and properly given the circumstances. Second, the real hero was Amina, who showed forgiveness and understanding. Third, the incident highlighted the need for better intelligence and identification procedures to prevent similar accidents. Finally, Maria stressed the importance of treating every person in Afghanistan, whether ally, enemy, or civilian, with basic human dignity. Her statements made their way up the chain of command, eventually reaching planners and strategists who were constantly trying to figure out how to fight this war more effectively. Some of her suggestions were incorporated into new training protocols. It was a small victory, but meaningful to Maria. The idea that Amina's suffering might prevent similar incidents in the future. Maria also wrote a long letter to Amina, care of the address where she had been relocated. She described her journey back, her feelings about everything that had happened, and her hope that Amina was settling into her new life. She included photos of herself and her team, wanting Amina to see the faces of the soldiers who had first caused her harm, but then tried to make it right. Maria didn't know if the letter would reach Amina or if she would respond, but writing it felt important. Weeks turned into months. Maria continued her work, leading convoys and training new soldiers in medical procedures. She became known as someone who could keep her head in crisis situations and who genuinely cared about the mission and the people affected by it. Her superiors took notice, and she was promoted to Sergeant First Class, a recognition of both her technical skills and leadership qualities. Then one day, about 4 months after leaving the compound, Maria received a package. It had been forwarded through multiple channels, inspected by security, and finally delivered to her. Inside was a letter from Amina, written in Pashto with an English translation attached. There was also a small gift, a hand-woven scarf in beautiful blues and greens, traditional Afghan craftsmanship. The letter described Amina's new life. She was teaching again in a school with over 100 students, both boys and girls. The local community had welcomed her and her mother. She was still recovering physically, with some lingering pain and reduced mobility in her left shoulder, but she could function normally. More importantly, she was healing emotionally, no longer haunted by nightmares of the raid. Amina wrote about forgiveness and moving forward. She said that holding on to anger and hate would only hurt herself, so she had chosen a different path. She thanked Maria for treating her as a human being rather than an enemy or a problem to be solved. The scarf was a gift from her mother, who wanted Maria to have something beautiful from Afghanistan, not just memories of violence and suffering. Maria cried when she read the letter. She showed it to Morrison and Wu, who had been with her through so much. They understood what it meant to receive forgiveness and gratitude from someone they had indirectly harmed. It was a kind of closure that few soldiers ever got in war. Maria wrote back immediately, describing how much the letter and gift meant to her. She shared news about life on the base and her continued efforts to improve medical procedures. She also told Amina that she carried the experience with her every day, that it had changed how she approached her duties and how she thought about the people of Afghanistan. The correspondence continued over the following months. The letters became less frequent but more personal. Amina shared her hopes for the future of Afghanistan, her work teaching children, and her belief that education was the path to peace. Maria shared her own dreams of one day working in veterans' health care, helping soldiers deal with the physical and emotional wounds of war. Lieutenant Reed also stayed in touch with Maria, occasionally sending messages through secure channels. He reported that his team had completed their deployment and returned to the United States. He was working with military training programs, using lessons learned from the incident to improve how Special Operations Forces identified and engaged targets in complex environments. Like Maria, he was trying to make something positive come from the mistakes of that night. The war in Afghanistan continued, as wars do, with victories and setbacks, progress and frustration. Maria completed her deployment and eventually rotated back to the United States. She left the military after 10 years of service, having achieved the rank of Master Sergeant and earning respect from everyone who served with her. She pursued education in trauma medicine and psychology, eventually working in a veterans hospital, helping soldiers deal with combat-related injuries and post-traumatic stress. Her experience with Amina informed her approach to care, reminding her that healing required not just medical treatment, but also compassion, understanding, and acknowledgement of the complex emotions that came with war. Years later, Maria received word that the war in Afghanistan had officially ended. American troops were withdrawing after 2 decades of conflict. She thought about all the people she had met during her deployment, the soldiers she had served with, the Afghan people she had encountered, and especially Amina, who had taught her that even in the worst circumstances, humanity could prevail. Maria still had the scarf Amina's mother had given her. She kept it in a special box along with photos, letters, and other mementos from her service. Sometimes, when the memories became too heavy, she would take out the scarf and remember the lesson it represented. That mistakes happen, even terrible ones, but how we respond to those mistakes defines us. That enemies can become friends when we choose understanding over anger. That forgiveness is possible even in the darkest circumstances. The story of Maria Chen and Amina became part of military training, though the names were changed to protect privacy. It was used as a case study in ethics classes, medical training programs, and leadership courses. It illustrated the complexity of modern warfare, where the lines between combatant and civilian were often blurred, and where split-second decisions could have lasting consequences.